So happy new year everybody. This is the first video that we're going to have on the channel, and I always think it's very interesting that at the turning of the year people often look to the future, they look to predictions. I mean, I've already seen a few articles online where they're predicting what's going to happen in 2026. They might look at some Nostradamus things, that prophecies that haven't actually come out yet. And I find it really interesting. So over Christmas, I've been looking into fortune telling, ancient ways, and that dreaded question as well. Will 2026 be the end of the year? Doomsday, the apocalypse, all that jazz. So I've got my favourite book here, which is the Folklore Myths of Britain. And I found an interesting quote in it that I thought you guys would enjoy. And it says, "The main reason why people attempt to seek the unknown through divination is that it is only with a presumed knowledge of the future that they can feel emotionally secure in the present." So I thought that was very interesting. So today I thought it's going to be a bit of a chilled out one. We're going to go for a little bit of a wander through Sherwood Forest, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the ancient fortune telling ways that I've learnt and how they sort of fit into our modern world even still today. So if you are ready for that, let's go. This video isn't about proving whether predictions are true or false. It's about looking at how, across history, people have tried to understand what comes next, and the beliefs, traditions and stories that grew out of that search. From ancient folklore and old rituals to royal courts and everyday habits we still recognise today, this is a story about the many ways people have tried to make sense of the future. And to explore that properly, it helps to slow things down, to step away from the noise of the modern world and return to places where people once looked for answers in quieter ways. So for this one, we're going with a winter walk and a look back to understand what lies ahead. I am going to make my first prediction of 2026, and I'm going to do it in proper fortune cookie jargon because I feel that's relevant for this video. So here we go. To understand what comes next, we have to look at where it all began. And that is why today we are here at Sherwood Forest, because this place, it has survived plagues, it has outlived kings and queens and rulers and all that sort of thing. So for the story, I thought it was only appropriate to come back here. Now, Sherwood Forest, of course, has lots of folklore and legends. And if you want me to do a video on that at another time, then please let me know. Now, for anybody that's new to the channel, I'm Claire. This is the Wanderlust way. I do want to say a huge thank you to everybody that supports the channel by liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing. I want to say a huge thank you to the members and the people that send the super thanks and donations, because you're the reason that this channel is growing and you're keeping the fire burning, shall we say. So if you're ready, wrap up warm, guys. It's a bit of a wintry walk, this one. That's enough waffle. Let's wander. Now, before there were books or charts or predictions written down on paper, people would look to nature for the answers. The sort of questions they might be wondering and they wanted answers to were whether the winter would be harsh, would the crops grow, would the decisions they make lead to safety or disaster, and nature was the perfect place to turn to look for these answers. Birds were some of the earliest guides. Ravens, swallows, owls, all seen as potential messengers. Their sudden absence, an unusual call or strange erratic flight could all be read as signs of what was to come. And if a forest like this were to suddenly fall unnaturally quiet, that too could be taken as a warning that something was shifting. People of those times understood the power of nature. They noticed patterns, they remembered them, and they passed them on. Now today we might be in the forest or in the woodlands or the hedgerows, and we might see a bush that is laden with berries, and we might stop and think, hey, that looks really pretty. Might even take a photograph, might even share it on Instagram. But our ancestors, if they saw a bush laden with berries, especially at certain times of the year, well, they would see that as a prediction. Some of them would see it as a prophecy, really, for what was coming in the future months.
For centuries in Britain, berries were read as more than decoration. A heavy crop of holly, hawthorn or rowan was often taken as a sign that a hard winter lay ahead. The thinking was simple. If birds and animals were going to need more food to survive the months to come, nature would provide it in advance. So, a hedgerow heavy with berries wasn't just something to admire, it was something to pay attention to. People remembered the years when the berries were thick and that the winters that followed were long or unforgiving. Now, there is no scientific proof that I'm told that berries can predict the severity of winter, but even today you might hear someone in the countryside remark a weather forecast after looking at the berries. An old wives' tale perhaps, but one that's not entirely gone away.
Now, people obviously looked at the nature and the natural world, but they didn't just look at what was surrounding it. They looked closer, a lot closer in fact. And in ancient Britain and in other parts of the world, they would often look inside the bodies of animals for answers and predictions of the future.
After a ritual killing, bones were examined, cracks, marks and unusual shapes. These weren't random details, they were studied carefully, believed to carry meaning about what was to come. In other cases, the rituals were more intense. Ancient writers described druids watching the moment of death itself, the way a body fell, the movements that followed, the flow of blood, believing that these final moments revealed messages from the gods. Those accounts come from Greek and Roman authors, and they need to be treated with care. They would often write with their own agendas, keen to portray Britain as strange or savage. But archaeology tells us something important. Ritual animal sacrifice was widespread in prehistoric Britain. The remains of dogs, horses, and cattle have been found placed deliberately in pits, rivers, and sacred spaces, suggesting these acts were bound up with belief, with offering, and with attempts to understand fate.
In our modern world, it can be really easy to look back at those ancient ways and think, God, how cruel is that? Especially vegan or vegetarian. The thought of taking animals apart and studying their entrails is pretty graphic and it's pretty grim. But what we've got to remember is these people didn't have the kind of science that we have today. They certainly didn't have the safety nets that we have. So the only way that they could predict the future was in these kind of ways.
In the Roman world, some of these ideas were shaped into more formal systems, where trained priests examined the internal organs of the sacrificed animals, believing the gods had written their messages there. Britain didn't necessarily follow those rigid Roman methods, but the instinct was the same: to look inside the body in search for answers, and believe that fate could be read there. What matters here isn't whether these practices were right or wrong, it's that people were desperate for certainty in a world where so much lay beyond their control. And forests like this weren't just places that people passed through, they were places where decisions were weighed, where signs were interpreted, where people stepped away from everyday life to try and glimpse the future. But in time, people began to look for answers beyond the landscape directly around them. They lifted their eyes from the earth and turned them toward the sky.
So I've come to understand and to learn that people used nature and they were kept close to the ground. They studied the animals, the changing of the seasons. All these things were used to look for answers and predictions. But what we haven't spoke about yet, and which we are going to be covering now, is when they started to look up, to look to the skies for even more answers.
The sky offered something the earth could not: regularity. The sun rose and set with dependable rhythm. The moon moved through clear phases. The stars returned to the same positions year after year. In a world where so much felt uncertain, the heavens appeared ordered, and order suggested something powerful, that the future might not be random. The earliest roots of astrology can be traced back thousands of years, as early as the 2nd millennium BC. There, priests carefully recorded the movement of the planets and stars on clay tablets. Unusual events in the sky, eclipses, comets, strange alignments, all read as messages from the gods. These weren't personal predictions, they were warnings about harvests, wars, rulers, and the fate of entire kingdoms. By the time these ideas reached the Greek and Roman worlds, astrology had become more structured. By the 2nd century AD, scholars were writing detailed works that framed astrology as a system governed by rules, calculation, and observation. This wasn't presented as guesswork, it was knowledge, something that could be learned, taught, and trusted. During the medieval period, astrology moved closer to everyday life. Birth charts became more common, mapping the position of the planets at the exact moment a person was born. These charts were used to make predictions about temperament, health, fortune, and crucially, what might lie ahead. Astrologers weren't cheap, nor were they marginal figures. Many were well paid. Some were attached to universities or royal households. Others worked alongside doctors. In fact, medicine and astrology were deeply linked. Some physicians believed that treating a patient without consulting the stars was dangerous, even irresponsible. Treatments were timed according to planetary movements, and a diagnosis was sometimes made with reference to a birth chart rather than the body alone. Prediction wasn't seen as optional, it was part of responsible decision-making.
So astrology was about compatibility as well, studying the stars and the signs and making sure that things lined up. So things like marriages, are two people compatible, should they be together? Same thing in business deals as well. Is it worth opening a business with a certain person, or is this business going to succeed? Journeys as well, they were really important, to look at the dates you were travelling, whether it was going to be safe. So the question was not necessarily bolted on truth, it was a question about whether the decisions you were making were wise.
Over time, astrology adapted. As science advanced, astrology gradually lost its formal authority, but it didn't disappear. Instead, it moved into popular culture. By the early 20th century, astrology columns were appearing in newspapers, offering predictions not to kings and scholars, but to ordinary readers. And sometimes those predictions unsettled people. In September 1930, astrologer Richard Harold Naylor, who had previously gained national attention after making 2 notable predictions relating to the royal family, was asked by the Sunday Express for another forecast. Naylor predicted that a British aircraft would be in danger during the month of October. He highlighted the astrological signs of Mars and Uranus, which he associated with sudden accidents or explosions. Funnily enough, on October the 5th, 1930, the R101, which was one of the largest airships ever built by the British government, crashed into a hillside. The hydrogen gas bags ignited and the airship was destroyed. The disaster resulted in the deaths of 48 of the 54 people on board. Naylor's previous prediction created a sensation through Britain. While sceptics dismissed it as coincidence, the public were captivated, and R.H. Naylor secured the first regular astrology column in a British newspaper.
In our modern world, astrology hasn't vanished, has it? Because we do still look at our horoscopes. We are still aware of our star signs. I mean, sometimes it's one of the first things you might ask somebody to break the ice. What star sign are you? And that curiosity is still there. So we're still looking for answers. However, the sort of questions that we're asking, they're not going to make much difference to the whole world, perhaps. But if we go further back and we look at astrology when it was used by people in power, so kings, queens and rulers, the question goes more from curiosity to becoming something very, very important indeed, because the answers that were provided, they could change the course of history.
In Tudor England, belief in prediction became part of the political landscape. Prophecies that supported the king's position were tolerated, even encouraged. Those that challenged him were not. During the reign of Henry VIII, this line was drawn brutally clear. One of the most striking examples is Elizabeth Barton, known as the Nun of Kent. Barton claimed she experienced religious visions. She publicly predicted that if Henry broke with the Catholic Church and remarried Anne Boleyn, he would die within months and be damned. Her visions were not dismissed, they were feared, because prophecy, when it questioned authority, was no longer spiritual, it was political.
In 1534, Elizabeth Barton was executed, not for superstition, but for threatening power.
At the same time, prediction could be embraced when it served the crown. One of the most trusted figures at court was John Dee. Dee was not a fortune teller on the fringes of power. He was a respected scholar, a mathematician, astronomer and map maker, deeply interested in numbers, symbols and the idea that the universe followed patterns that could be understood. Queen Elizabeth I trusted him. Before her coronation in 1559, Dee was consulted to calculate the most favourable date for her reign to begin. This wasn't ceremony for show, it was preparation. The belief was simple: begin a reign under the right conditions and the reign itself would be strengthened.
Belief in prediction didn't fade with time, it simply adapted.
In France, during the Napoleonic era, the fortune teller Marie-Anne Lenormand became closely associated with Empress Josephine. Lenormand made a number of predictions about Josephine's future that later appeared remarkably accurate, and for a time Napoleon Bonaparte himself sought her counsel. The fortune teller later claimed to have warned of Napoleon's disastrous Russian campaign, a warning he is said to have dismissed. Whether remembered clearly at the time or sharpened by hindsight, her reputation only grew as events unfolded, and with it the familiar question: was this foresight or coincidence? Even in Britain's modern age, the instincts lingered. In 1902, Edward VII became the last British monarch known to officially consult a fortune teller before his coronation. A celebrity palmist whose clients included politicians, writers and royalty across Europe. Edward VII consulted him to choose an auspicious date, not out of superstition, but of caution. What all of these stories reveal is not whether predictions are true or false, it's how seriously they were taken. Prophecy could legitimise decisions, fuel suspicion, justify punishment. In the hands of power, belief in the future was never harmless, because when rulers listened to prediction, they didn't just wait for the future, they acted on it.
What's interesting, I think, is that while some fortune tellers and astrologers were welcomed into, say, royal circles, they were in the high society, shall we say, not everybody was. And we might imagine some seers lived in forests like this. That wasn't always necessarily the case, but they did, many of them, live on the fringes of society.
The image of the lone seer living deep in the woods is a powerful one, but it's largely a product of folklore rather than everyday historical reality. But whilst we could spend hours splitting truth from imagination, there's no denying the fact that for the majority of these wise people, the forest and nature did play an important role. Places like Sherwood Forest weren't just somewhere to retreat from the world, they were somewhere to understand it. Because long before laboratories or formal medicine, woodland knowledge sat at the centre of both healing and fortune telling. Plants were gathered, tested, passed down, Remedies were learned alongside careful observation of seasons, weather, animals and human behaviour. The ability to heal and the ability to foresee were often closely linked.
When I first started looking into this, I'll be honest, I had this image of a wise old man or woman living in the forest in some kind of ramshackle shed, maybe with some animal skulls on there, decorating their walls. And to be honest, that's really not the case. Those images have probably come from folklore books and movies, shall we say. But the truth is, a lot of these fortune tellers, they lived in towns and cities. They were surrounding normal people, and they did it on the side a lot of the time. So they'd have a normal job and then they do a little bit of fortune telling on the side. And at this point, some of them were nomadic as well. So I think at this point it's worth mentioning the Romany gypsy community, because the Romany gypsy community played a huge role in shaping the image of fortune telling in Britain.
In Britain, no group shaped popular fortune-telling more visibly than the Romany gypsy communities. Tarot reading and palmistry became closely associated with Romany culture, particularly from the 18th century onwards, when it became famous in certain areas. These practices were portable, symbolic and adaptable, well suited to a travelling way of life. Romany fortune tellers were often highly visible, setting up at fairs, seaside resorts and market towns. Tarot offered a way of talking about love, luck, loss, the things that seemed to really matter to people. People sought them out, and yet visibility came at a cost.
So the Romany gypsy community, they faced suspicion, restriction in certain laws, and although they could make a small income from fortune telling, it did mean that they were then discriminated, cast away as a certain outsiders, shall we say, of society. And what's interesting about this, I think, is that they were needed because obviously people were using them. They wanted to know their fortune, but they weren't quite fully accepting of them.
That uneasy balance runs through many stories of prediction. Figures like Mother Shipton, whose story we explored a few months ago on this channel, sit perfectly in this space. Associated with prophecy, healing and the natural world, she was remembered as someone apart from society. It places her on the edge, that mixture of need and fear from the community around her. But whatever people thought of her, they still valued her prophecies. Often garbled words, and sadly, while some seem to come true, there's a lot of debate surrounding them, because, let's face it, people lie. They adapt the truth to fit their own narrative, and some people did that with Mother Shipton's warnings. We now know that some prophecies attributed to her were actually written centuries later. But once they were in print, they carry more authority. And this is how prophecy spreads. And I'll be gentle and I'll say it's perhaps not always through deliberate deceit, but repetition, fear and hindsight which can quickly turn a person's words into something that suits a different narrative entirely.
It's no surprise, knowing what we know, that a lot of fortune tellers were criticised, they were ridiculed, they were mocked, and I think that's still the case today. Some people believe, some people don't. And whether you believe or you don't believe that it's possible to predict the future, one thing I want to talk about now is something that we all do, regardless of where we live in the world, whether you're in the city or you're surrounded by nature. Most of us do this, and most of us do it almost every night. Some of us don't. I know they don't, because people I know, Adi doesn't dream. But yeah, a lot of us dream. And some people believe that through dreams we can find meanings, and some people believe that dreams can predict the future. Now, scientists would probably argue that dreams are actually some kind of memory dump. It's our brains trying to process everything that's happened during the day. It might be our subconscious. Therapists might say it's a way of us trying to find answers to questions we haven't been able to solve. But I'm going to tell you a story now about a dream, a very famous dream that happened, that really made me question whether it was possible for dreams to predict the future.
Across Europe, dream work was long treated as a serious way of accessing insight. Certain plants were believed to encourage vivid or meaningful dreams, not as magical shortcuts, but as tools to alter awareness and perception. Mugwort, for example, appears again and again in folk traditions linked to dreaming and foresight, often found growing wild in disturbed soil and hedgerows. It was sometimes taken as a tea, sometimes burned, or placed beneath a pillow, believed to bring clarity to dreams that felt symbolic or unsettling. In a quieter world without artificial light or constant noise, dreams carried weight. When one lingered, it was remembered, turned over, and questioned.
So the famous dream story that I told you I would bring up. Now it involves Abraham Lincoln, who was of course the American president. And Abraham Lincoln had this dream. He was in the White House and he could hear everybody crying. So he followed the sobs and it led him to a room where there was a coffin, a body laid out. And in the dream, Abraham Lincoln turned to a soldier who was stood at the door and he said, "Who's in the coffin? Who's died? Why is everybody crying?" And the soldier turned to him and he said, "It's the president. He's been assassinated." Now, what's strange obviously about this is that Abraham Lincoln was indeed assassinated a few days after this dream, and he had told his friends about this dream. So when it happened and he died, a lot of them started to remember what he told them, and it became a famous dream about. It became a famous dream prediction sort of story, shall we say?
Lincoln, of course, didn't act on his dream, but after his death, those who had heard the story, of course, remembered it, and I imagine they would have found it quite unsettling. A sense that the future had brushed past quietly before arriving in full. Stories like this resist certainty. They sit somewhere between belief and coincidence. Predictions not just of what might happen, but of what might end. And that's exactly where the next chapter takes us.
There is something that I have been thinking about in the back of my mind whilst I was researching this, and it's all well and good, the questions that some of us ask to the future. They might be about jobs, relationships, whether we're going to have a happy new year, all those sort of things, and they're fairly innocent. But there is a point when our curiosity about the future can become really quite heavy, because it's one thing asking what's happening next, and another asking when the whole thing is going to end.
Doomsday, the apocalypse, the end of the world, however you label it, the notion is the same. It's a prediction that outweighs any other we could possibly ask, because let's face it, if it happens, it overrides everything. Our emotions, our careers, our love lives. When you start looking back through history, there's often a pattern. Predictions about the future tend to become darker when people are already on edge. Yes, they pop up around certain dates, and here we circle back to the numbers again, but more sinister predictions also thrive during times of illness, war, and social upheaval. And I find it fascinating and quite unsettling how often this pattern repeats. In the Middle Ages, for example, outbreaks of plague, they weren't always seen as disease. They were sometimes seen as the result of human behaviour, punishment for sins committed, or signs that the world itself was breaking down. Fear could grow from anything that didn't make sense. A comet in the sky, strange weather. If something was out of the ordinary, then there was a chance that it was a warning and that something terrible was coming. And the truth is, fear often spreads faster than hope. Once ideas like this take hold, they can move with frightening speed across vast distances. And when we fast forward to today, it's quite striking how little our instincts have really changed. We might think that we're more rational now with science on our side, but time and time again we fall into the same patterns as our ancestors.
Cast your minds back, if you can, to 2012. I am sure a lot of you will be remembering what happened then, but if not, let me give you a little bit of a refresh.
December the 21st, 2012, was the day many people believed the world would end, either completely or through some catastrophic event that would mean life as we knew it would never be the same again. This belief grew from interpretations of the ancient Mayan calendar. We were told by some very clever people that this was the date the calendar ran out. And rather than leaving it at that, the idea filtered its way into mainstream media, and with every new insight, it snowballed. Documentaries were released, news articles circulated, apocalyptic films hit cinema screens.
Now, I'm sure a lot of us remember some of the films that hit the cinemas, ones like Day After Tomorrow, that's one of my personal favourites, or 2012. I mean, they were all apocalyptic sort of style, cities being engulfed by water, the prospect of the end of a civilization. And while half of them it's dramatic, it's entertainment for us, and a lot of us probably just take it as a bit of fun. For other people, it can be quite frightening thinking about the end of the world. It's quite a fearful concept, really, and in truth, fear can spread faster than facts.
We saw something similar again during the recent pandemic. As COVID spread, people didn't just look to scientists, they looked backwards. They revisited previous pandemics, they searched for patterns and tried to predict what our fate might be. Second waves, worse waves, final waves, in some cases even total collapse. And this is where prediction becomes dangerous, not because everyone believes it, but because if enough people believe it a little, it can shape behaviour. It can make people withdraw, panic, or even give up. And history shows us where this can lead.
I'm sure you already know there are groups and cults out there that have predicted the end of the world. Sometimes they use religious prophecy or celestial events, but sometimes, most of the time, what happens next is chillingly consistent.
People stop planning for the future. They cut themselves off from society. They begin to believe that death isn't a loss but an escape. I won't name specific cases here, but there are examples where belief in the world ending led to mass suicide. And these people didn't start out wanting to die, they started out uncertain, asking the same question we've been asking all along: what's coming next? For some, apocalyptic belief offered an answer, a form of certainty, and perhaps for people who struggle with uncertainty, that certainty, however terrifying, felt easier than not knowing at all. I really don't know. It is such a deep subject. But it's an uncomfortable thought that when the future feels too complex, too frightening, or too out of control, an ending can feel simpler. And that is both worrying and terrifying. But if we step back and look at history, it teaches us something important. So far, touch wood, despite every predicted end of the world, it hasn't happened. Plagues have passed and wars have ended. Societies have learned to adapt. They've changed, yes, but the world didn't end. But after knowing all this, for me, perhaps the most unsettling question isn't when will the world end? It's why we keep needing to imagine that it will. And on that note, let's lighten the tone a little again, and let's look at how today, when we're not studying ancient calendars, we still turn to other things in search of answers.
Now, one of the reasons I decided to look into this topic for you today is because I actually find it really fascinating that despite all this science that we've now got behind us, people still are having their tarot cards read, they are still looking at tea leaves at the bottom of their cup for answers. And I think it's because a lot of us still want that kind of comfort of being able to know what's coming next. So now we are going to delve into some of the most popular fortune telling methods that are used in the modern world and look at how they were also used by our ancestors.
A survey in 2024 found that 36% of UK adults were either interested or involved in having their fortunes told. In the last few years alone, there have been a growing surge in popularity for tarot readings. I'm told that millions are flocking to platforms like TikTok, especially for this. Now, I'm not here to say what's right and wrong. I want you to decide that and let me know what you think. But we'll look at some ways of fortune telling, how it's done today and how it's popular. But before we do that, I would like to just give you a few facts. Now, the online psychic reading market size was valued at just under $864 million in 2024. And it's anticipated to reach $1,304 million by 2032. That is obviously proof that lots of people want answers. And we might not all be asking the really tough questions like, is the world going to end in 2026? We might be asking things like, will things work out for us? Are we on the right path? Do the people that we love us back? That sort of thing. So where do people turn in 2026 when they have those sorts of questions? Yes, some might still turn to the forest, then look up at the skies, to nature, but there's a few more less messy ways than exploring animal entrails, thank goodness, that we can consider.
The first one is, of course, tarot, and if you're on TikTok or anything like that, you'll see it on a daily basis if that's the sort of thing that you're looking for.
Financial reports indicate that tarot market size reached a notable sum in 2025, with projections for continued growth. And there are countless tarot decks you can buy, ranging from traditional ones to themed decks based on popular culture, to natural ones inspired by animals or herbs, to specific spiritual paths. There are so many to choose from, and so many ways people can find meaning, comfort, and support from tarot. But despite how dramatic they can look, especially to beginners, tarot, it's not really about fixed outcomes. It's symbolic and interpretive, a way of talking through situations rather than predicting them outright. The cards don't tell you what will definitely happen. They invite you to reflect on where you are now and where you might be heading if nothing changes. And that's why tarot, I think, has lasted, because it doesn't promise certainty, it offers perspective.
Next up we have palmistry or palm reading. Now this is a very, very ancient practice.
The most common belief is that palmistry began in ancient India as part of Hindu astrology, and then it spread to China, to Tibet, to Persia, to Babylonia, etc., etc. By the time palmistry reached Britain and Europe, it was already deeply tied to ideas about character, health, and life patterns. The palm reader looks at the hand, and they usually look at four main things. The shape, which is believed to reflect the temperament. The lines, and the major ones, they are thought to show how your energy is used, how you think, how you relate to others. And then there's the mounts on the raised area of the palms, the fleshy pads under the fingers, and they're often named after planets like Venus or Jupiter, and they might show where someone's energy is strong. A prominent mount might suggest ambition, emotion, intuition, or drive. Lastly, the palm reader might consider the texture, temperature, and flexibility, and this is believed to reveal vitality, openness, or emotional reserve. It's all about learning more about ourselves to help understand our fate.
If there's one thing that us Brits love doing more than anything, it is drinking tea. And I've read recently that we drink something like over 100 million cups a day. That's obviously not each, that's between us, obviously. So it's no surprise then that tea leaf reading became part of British culture.
The British first started drinking tea in the 1650s. Back then, it was an expensive novelty, arriving via the Dutch East India Company, who were also supplying places like Paris and Holland. Tea was so costly that those who could afford it often kept it locked away, treated almost like a prized possession. Now, I'm not here to give us a full history lesson on tea. If you do want one, let me know. I'll do a bit more research and I'll consider it for a future video. But what matters here is that by the early 19th century, Britain had become a tea-drinking nation. And once tea became everyday, so did the rituals around it. If we time travel back to China for a moment, tea had been part of life there for thousands of years, long before it ever reached Britain. And it wasn't just a drink, it was tied to philosophy, ritual and reflection. When loose leaves were brewed, the shapes they left behind were noticed, contemplated and sometimes interpreted. Not as fixed prophecy, but as guidance, a way of thinking. Now, when the habit arrived in Britain, it settled easily into domestic life. A cup of tea after a meal, a pause in conversation, a moment to turn the cup and take a look. Now, people began to associate certain shapes with certain meanings. A bird might suggest news. A path could hint at travel. A ring might point to commitment or partnership. Nothing was absolute, and that was the point. The symbols were flexible, shaped by the person asking the question as much as by what appeared in the cup. Tea leaf reading didn't demand belief, it invited reflection. And that's probably why that one stuck. Even today, tea leaf reading hasn't vanished. It's still practiced quietly, sometimes seriously, sometimes playfully, often as a moment to slow down, sit with a thought and see what comes up. In a world that moves fast and rarely gives us space to pause, there's something comforting about that. Because just like so many forms of fortune telling, it isn't really about the leaves knowing the future, it's about what we notice and what we're already thinking when we finally stop long enough to look.
Next up is crystal gazing and clairvoyance. Now, this is the sort of thing that a lot of fortune telling imagery is surrounded about. You might picture that wise old woman who's standing round a crystal ball. But the truth is, it's actually a little bit more complex than that.
Crystal gazing, or scrying, as is its proper term, is not about the object itself. It's not a magical ball that contains magic properties. The crystal isn't believed to contain the future, for example, but it is believed to help still the mind. The idea behind crystal gazing is surprisingly simple. By fixing your attention on something reflective, a crystal, a bowl of water, polished metal, even a mirror, the everyday noise of thought is supposed to quieten. And once the mind is quiet, it's more likely that images, impressions or ideas can rise more easily to the surface. What was often said to be seen in these surfaces wasn't always dramatic visions. They might be fleeting shapes, feelings or symbols, and then they would be interpreted by the reader through intuition rather than logic. And that's where clairvoyance comes in. Clairvoyance literally means clear seeing. Not seeing the future as a set series of events, but seeing beyond the obvious, picking up on the impressions, the connections and the possibilities that aren't immediately visible. Historically, clairvoyants were consulted for all sorts of reasons. Missing objects, decisions, relationships, health, moments where logic alone didn't feel quite enough. And while skeptics have always existed, belief in clairvoyancy has never really disappeared. It's just adapted.
If you grew up in Britain in the 20th century, then chances are you will recognise this next clairvoyant that I'm going to mention, because she appeared on our TV screens on a Saturday night just before the National Lottery draw. And many of us, whether we believed it or not, we still huddled around our TV screens to find out who she would predict the next British millionaire would be. I am talking, of course, about Mystic Meg, or was it Septic Peg? Was it Brian Connolly who did a joke about that, didn't he? So who remembers Mystic Meg?
Mystic Meg's appearance on the National Lottery show was draped in stars and symbolism. It was theatrical, a little tongue-in-cheek, and something we all pretended not to take too seriously. Yet millions of us still watched, some laughed, some rolled their eyes, and some quietly hoped that she might be thinking of them. And that's what crystal gazing and clairvoyancy tap into. Hope. That luck might lean your way, and that there might be more going on beneath the surface than we can easily explain. Because in many ways, if that's true, then it might help us make sense of some of the everyday things that we just can't explain. Mystic Meg stopped giving us her predictions on the National Lottery Live in 2000, dropped, I believe, by the BBC as part of the revamp, but I'm sure some of the British public didn't completely forget her. Today, people still visit clairvoyants, they still attend readings, and they still look for reassurance, guidance, or a sense of calm. Not because they believe everything will be foretold, but because sometimes, in a world of uncertainty, it helps to believe that someone or something might see a little further ahead. Moving on now, with everything we've touched on so far still in the back of our minds, let's look at another prediction that famously came true. Because in the 17th century England, an astrologer named William Lilly published a series of illustrated prophecies. One of them showed the city of London engulfed in flames. And when the Great Fire of London tore through the city in 1666, destroying thousands of homes, people remembered Lilly. And suddenly, what had once been dismissed as symbolism felt dangerously specific. So specific, in fact, that Lilly was questioned by authorities and accused of having prior knowledge or even an involvement in the fire. The idea that someone could foresee this disaster was unsettling enough. The idea that they might know it was coming was worse. Lilly was thankfully never convicted, but the suspicion lingered. Because once a prediction appears to come true, it changes how people look at the person who made it. The truth is, most predictions don't land clearly. Lilly wasn't the only one to predict the Great Fire of London. And sometimes warnings, they resurface all the time with new interpretations centuries later. Take Nostradamus, he pops up all the time in articles about what's coming next. His writings are famously symbolic, undated and written in riddles rather than plain language. They don't close neatly and they don't finish, which means they can be reopened. They can be applied to new events by each generation that encounters them.
So that is it. The first wonder of 2026 is done. Thanks to everybody for watching. Let me know in the comments, have you tried any of these fortune telling ways? Did it make you believe in it more, or did it make you more skeptical? I'd just love to know your thoughts on it. And also let me know, would you want to know if the end of the world was approaching? That's quite a deep one, isn't it? So thanks everybody, and I'll see you all on next week's episode. Take care, have a great week, bye.
January is often when we look ahead the hardest, when we ask what the year will bring, whether things will get better, whether we'll be luckier, healthier, happier. And maybe that's why fortune telling in all its forms has never really gone away. Not because we want certainty, but because we want reassurance. And I'm not here to tell you what to believe, and I don't think this story has a neat conclusion, but I would still love to know what you think and how important you feel it is to know what's coming next. So with that, I want to wish you all a very, very happy 2026.